Tickets. Tickets, please. Step inside, take a ride upon the terror train. All aboard, be fair warned, these rails house fear and pain. Find a seat, don't mind the heat, just pray the lights stay on. Upon these rails, these bloody rails, in darkness lies no dawn. Yes, step inside, come crawl or glide, with us you shall remain. Upon this ride, this hellish ride, we call the terror train. Ticket, please. James Ward Kirk Publications presents Terror Train. Episode 117, Montana.
Welcome aboard. Welcome to my home. I am the disembodied voice, your ghost host, so to speak. Call me Terror. Welcome to my train. Be you dead, undead, or of the living. Tonight we have but one passenger boarding our train of terror. In exchange for his delicious mortal soul, he has penned the tale of an antique steam engine. That is not at all what it appears to be. Take a seat and prepare to stay a while. Listen as the conductor is handed a bloody ticket which reads William F. Nolan. Lonely train coming. Yes, that's right, William. Those doors have permanently closed behind you.
Ticket, please. Lonely Train A-Comin' by William F. Nolan. Lonely train a-comin', I can hear its cry. Lonely train from nowhere, taking me to die. Folk ballad fragment, circa 1881. At Bitterroot, Ventry waited. Bone cold, huddled on the narrow wooden bench against the paint-blistered wall of the depot, the collar of his fleece-lined coat turned up against the chill Montana winds blowing in from the plains. He waited for the train. Beneath the wide brim of a work-blackened Stetson, sweat-stained along the headband, his eyes were intense, the gunmetal color of blued steel. Hard lines etched into the mahogany of his face spoke of deep snow winters and glare sun summers. His hands, inside heavy leather work gloves, were calloused and blunt-fingered from punishing decades of ranch work. Autumn was dying, and the sky over Bitterroot was gray with the promise of winter. This would be the train's last run before snow closed down the route. Ventry had calculated it with consummate patience and precision. He prided himself on his stubborn practicality, and he had earned a reputation among his fellow ranchers as a hard-headed realist. Paul Ventry was never an emotional man. Even at his wife's death, he had remained stolid, rock-like in his grief. If it was Sarah's time to die, then so be it. He had loved her, but she was gone, and he was alone, and that was fact. Ventry accepted. Sarah had wanted children, but things hadn't worked out that way. So they had each other, and the ranch, and the open Montana sky, and that had been enough. Amy's death was not the same. Losing his sister had been wrong. He did not accept it, and that was why he was doing this, why he was here. In his view, he had no other choice. He had been unable to pinpoint the train's exact arrival, but he was certain it would pass Bitterroot within a 7-day period. Thus, he had brought along enough food and water to last a week. His supplies were almost depleted now, but they could be stretched through 2 more days and nights if need be. Ventry was not worried. The train would be here. It was lonely at Bitterroot. The station master's office, closed, with bars covering the windows, was once the route into Ross Fork, but became dropped from the rail schedule 6 months ago. Mainline trains bound for Lewiston no longer made the stop. Now, the only trains that rattled past were desolate freights, dragging their endless, rusted flat cars. Ventry shifted the holstered axe pressing against his thigh, and unzipping a side pocket on his coat, he took out the thumb-worn postcard. On the picture side, superimposed over a multicolored panoramic shot of a plains sunset, was the standard Montana salutation. Greetings from the Big Sky Country. On the reverse, Amy's last words. How many times he had read her hastily scrawled message, mailed from this depot almost a year ago to the day. Dear Polly, I'll write a long letter, I promise, when I get to Lewiston, but the train came early, so I just have time, dear brother, to send you my love. And don't you worry about your little kid sister, because life for me is going to be super with my new job. Love and XXXXXXX, Amy. And she had added a quick P.S. at the bottom of the card. You should see this beautiful old train.
Didn't know they still ran steam locomotives like this one. Gotta rush, 'cause it's waiting for me." Ventry's mouth tightened, and he slipped the card back into his coat, thinking about Amy's smiling eyes, about how much a part of his life she'd been. Hell, she was a better sheep rancher than half the valley men on Big Moccasin. However, once grown, she'd wanted city life, a city job, a chance to meet city men. "Just you watch me, Paulie," she had told him, her face shining with excitement. "This little old job in Lewiston is only the beginning. The firm has a branch in Helena, and I'm sure I can get transferred there within a year. You're going to be real proud of your sis. I'll make you proud." She never had the chance. She'd never reached Lewiston. Amy had stepped aboard the train and vanished. Yet people don't vanish. Vanished was a word Paul refused to accept. He had driven each bleak mile of the rail line from Bitterroot to Lewiston, combing every inch of terrain for a sign, a clue, a scrap of clothing. He'd spent 2 months along that route and had found nothing. Ventry posted a public reward for information leading to Amy's whereabouts. That led to Tom Hellendorf contacting him. Hellendorf was a game warden stationed at Kings Hill Pass in the Lewis and Clark National Forest. He phoned Ventry, telling him about what he'd found near an abandoned spur track in the Little Belt Range. Bones. Human bones. And a ripped, badly stained, red leather purse. The empty purse had belonged to Amy. Forensic evidence established the bones as part of her skeleton. What had happened up there in those mountains? The district sheriff, John Longbow, blamed it on a weirdo, a roving tramp. "Do it plain obvious, Mr. Ventry," the sheriff had said to her. "He killed her for what she had in the purse. You admit she was carrying several hundred in cash, which is, begging your pardon, a damn fool thing to do. But that didn't explain the picked bones. A lot of wild animals in the mountains," the lawman had declared. "After this weirdo done her in, he just left her lying there. And, well, probably a bear come onto her. It's happened before. We've found bones up in that area more than once. A lot of strange things in the Little Belt." And the sheriff had grinned. "As a boy with the tribe, I heard me stories that'd curl your hair. It's wild country." The railroad authorities were adamant about the mystery train. "No steamers in these parts," they told him. "Nobody runs them anymore." But Ventry was gut certain that such a train existed, and that Amy had died on it. Someone had cold-bloodedly murdered his sister and dumped her body in the mountains. He closed down the ranch, sold his stock, and devoted himself to finding out who that someone was. He spent an entire month at the main library in Lewiston, poring through old newspaper files, copying names, dates, details. A pattern emerged. Ventry found that a sizable number of missing persons who had vanished in this area of the state over the past decade had been traveling by rail, and several of them had disappeared along the same basic route Amy had chosen. Ventry confronted John Longbow with his research. "And just who is this killer?" the sheriff said. "Whoever owns the steamer. Some freak rail buff, rich enough to run a private train, and crazy enough to kill the passengers who get on board. Look, Mr. Ventry, how come nobody's seen this fancy steam train of yours?" "Because the rail disappearances happen at night, at remote stations off the main lines. He never runs the train by daylight. Probably keeps it up in the mountains. Maybe in one of the old mine shafts. Uses offline spur tracks. comes rolling into a small depot like Bitterroot between the regular passenger trains and picks up whoever's on the platform. The sheriff had grunted at this, his eyes tight on Paul Ventry's face. And there's a definite cycle to these disappearances, Ventry continued. According to what I've put together, the train makes its night runs at specific intervals, about a month apart, spring through fall. Then it's hidden away in the Little Belt each winter when the old spur tracks are snowed over. I've done a lot of calculation on this, and I'm certain that the train makes its final run during the first week of November, which means you've still got time to stop it. The sheriff had studied Paul Ventry for a long, silent moment. Then he had sighed deeply. That's an interesting theory, Mr. Ventry. Real interesting. But it's also about as wild and unproven as any I've heard. And I've heard me a few. Now, it's absolutely natural that you're upset at your sister's death, but you've let things get way out of whack. I figured you'd best go back to your ranch and try and forget about poor little Amy. Put her out of your mind. She's gone, and there's nothing you can do about that. We'll see, Ventry had said, a cutting edge to his voice. We'll see what I can do. Ventry's plan was simple. Stop the train, board it, and kill the twisted son of a bitch who owned it. Put a .45 slug in his head, blow his fucking brains out, and blow up his train with him. I'll put an end to this if no one else will, Ventry promised himself. And I've got the tools to do it. He slipped the carefully wrapped gun rig from his knapsack, unfolded its oiled covering, and withdrew his grandfather's long-barreled Frontier Colt from its worn leather holster. The gun was a family treasure. Its bone handle was cracked and yellowed by the years, but the old Colt was still in perfect firing order. His granddaddy had worn this rig, had defended his mine on the Comstock against claim jumpers with this gun. It was fitting and proper that it killed the man who'd killed Amy. Night was settling over Bitterroot. The fiery orange disk of sun had dropped below the Little Belt Mountains, and the sky was gray slate along the horizon. Time to strap on the gun. Time to get ready for the train. It's coming tonight. Lord God, I can feel it out there in the gathering dark, thrumming the rails. I can feel it in my blood and bones. Well then, come ahead, God damn you. Whoever you are, I'm ready. 10 p.m. 11. Midnight. It came at midnight. Rushing toward Bitterroot, clattering in fierce-wheeled thunder, its black bulk sliding over the track in the ash-dark Montana night like an immense, segmented snake, with a single yellow eye probing the terrain ahead. Ventry heard it long before he saw it. The rails sang and vibrated around him as he stood tall and resolute in mid-track, a 3-cell silver flashlight in his right hand, his heavy sheepskin coat buttoned over the gun at his belt. I have to flag it down. With the depot closed, it won't make a stop. No passengers. It's looking for live game, and it doesn't figure on surprising anyone here in Bitterroot. Surprise. I'm here. I'm alive. Like Amy. Like all the others. Man alone at night. Needs a ride. Climb aboard, partner. Make yourself at home. Drink. Something to eat. What's your pleasure? My pleasure is your death. And the death of your freak train, mister. That's my pleasure. It was in sight now, coming fast, slicing a bright round hole in the night, and its sweeping locomotive beam splashed Paul Ventry's body with a pale luminescence. The rancher swung his flash up, then down, in a high arc. Again and again. "Stop, you bastard! Stop!" The train began slowing. Sparks showered from the massive driving wheels as the train slowed, slowing, slower. Steel shrieking against steel, an easing of primal force. It was almost upon him. Like a great shining insect, the locomotive towered high and black over Ventry, its tall stack shutting out the stars. The rusted tip of the train's thrusting metal cowcatcher gently nudged the toe of his right boot as the incredible night mammoth slid to a final grinding stop. Now the train was utterly motionless, breathing its white steam into the cold dark, waiting for him, as he had waited for it. Ventry felt a surge of exultation fire his body. He'd been right. It was here, and he was prepared to destroy it, to avenge his sister. It was his destiny. He felt no fear, only a cool and certain confidence in his ability to kill. A movement at the corner of his eye. Someone was waving to him from the far end of the train, from the last coach, the train's only source of light. All of the other passenger cars were dark and blind-windowed. Only the last car glowed hazy yellow. Ventry eased around the breathing locomotive, his boots crunching loudly in the cindered gravel as he moved over the roadbed. He glanced up at the locomotive's high, double-windowed cabin, but the engineer was lost behind opaque, soot-colored glass. Ventry kept moving steadily forward, toward the distant figure, passing along the linked row of silent, lightless passenger cars. The train bore no markings. It was a uniform, unbroken black. Ventry squinted at the beckoning figure. Was it the killer himself, surprised and delighted at finding another passenger at this deserted night station? He slipped the flash into his shoulder knapsack and eased a hand inside his coat, gripping the warm bone handle of the .45 at his waist. "You've had one surprise tonight, mister. Get ready for another." Then, abruptly, he stopped, heart pounding. Ventry recognized the beckoning figure. Impossible! An illusion. Just couldn't be. Yet there she was, smiling, waving to him. "Amy!" Ventry rushed toward his sister in a stumbling run. But she was no longer in sight when he reached the dimly illumined car. Anxiously, he peered into one of the smoke-yellowed windows. A figure moved hazily inside. "Amy!" He shouted her name again, mounting the coach steps. The moment Ventry's boot touched the car's upper platform, the train jolted into life. Ventry was thrown to his knees as the coach lurched violently forward. The locomotive's big driving wheels sparked against steel, gaining a solid grip on the rails as the train surged powerfully from Bitterroot Station. Paul Ventry entered the coach, and the door snap-locked behind him. Remote-controlled device, to make sure I won't leave by the rear exit. No matter. He'd expected that. He could get out when he had to, when he was ready. He'd come prepared for whatever this madman had in mind. But Ventry had not been prepared for the emotional shock of seeing Amy. Had he really seen her? Was it his sister? No, of course not. He'd been tricked by his subconscious mind, and the fault was his. A lapse in concentration, in judgment. But someone had waved to him. A young girl who looked, at first sight, amazing like his dead sister. Where was she now? And just where was the human devil who ran this train? Ventry was alone in the car. To either side of the aisle, the rows of rich upholstered green velvet seats were empty. A pair of ornate, scrolled gas lamps, mounted above the arched doorway, cast flickering shadows over antique brass fittings and a hand-carved wood ceiling. Green brocade draped the windows. He didn't know much about trains, but Ventry knew this one had to be pre-1900. Probably restored by the rich freak who owned it. Plush was the word. Well, it was making its last run. Ventry would see to that. He pulled the flash from his shoulder pack, snapping on the bright beam as he moved warily forward. The flashlight proved unnecessary as Ventry entered the second door. Door unlocked. Guess he doesn't mind my going forward. The overhead gas lamps sputtered to life, spreading their pale yellow illumination over the length of the coach. Again, the plush velvet seats were empty, except for one. The last seat at the far end of the car. A woman was sitting there, stiff and motionless in the dim light, her back to Ventry. As he moved toward her, she turned slowly to face him. By Christ, it was Amy! Paul Ventry rushed to her, sudden tears stinging his eyes. Fiercely, he embraced his sister. She was warm and solid in his arms. "Oh, sis, I'm so glad you're alive!" But there was no sound from her lips. No words. No emotion. She was rigid in his embrace. Ventry stepped away from her. "What's wrong? I don't understand why you—" His words choked off. Amy had leaped from the seat, cat-quick, to fasten long, pale fingers around his throat. Her thumbs dug like sharp spikes into the flesh of Ventry's neck. He reeled back, gasping for breath, clawing at the incredibly strong hands. He couldn't break her grip. Amy's face was changing. The flesh was falling away in gummy, wet ribbons, revealing raw, white bone. In the deep sockets of Amy's grinning skull, her eyes were hot, red points of fire. Ventry's right hand found the butt of the Colt, and he dragged the gun free of its holster. Swinging the barrel toward Amy, he fired directly into the melting horror of her face. His bullets drilled round, charred holes in the grinning skull. But Amy's fingers, now all raw bone and slick gristle, maintained their death grip at his throat. "Axe! Use the axe!" In a swimming red haze, Ventry snapped the short-handled woodman's axe free of his belt and swung it sharply downward, neatly removing Amy's head at shoulder level. The clean, severed skull rolled down the aisle. Yet, horribly, the bony fingers increased their deadly pressure. Ventry's sight blurred. The coach wavered. The last of his oxygen cut off. He verged of blacking out. Desperately, he swung the blade again, missing the Amy thing entirely. The axe buried itself in thick green velvet. The train thrashed. Its whistle shrieked wildly in the rushing night, a cry of pain, and the seat rippled in agony. Oily black liquid squirted from the sliced velvet. At Ventry's throat, the bony fingers dropped away. In numbed shock, he watched his sister's rotting corpse flow down into the seat, melting and mixing with the central train body, bubbling wetly. "Oh, sweet Jesus," Everything's moving. The whole foul train is alive. And Ventry accepted it. Sick with horror and revulsion, he accepted it. He was a realist, and this thing was real. No fantasy. No dream. Real. Which meant he had to kill it. Not the man who owned it, because such a man did not exist. Somehow, the train itself, ancient and rusting in the high mountains, had taken on a sentient life of its own. The molecular components of iron and wood and steel had, over a slow century, transformed themselves into living tissue. And this dark hell thing had rolled out onto the Montana plains, seeking food, seeking flesh to sustain it, sleeping, sated, through the frozen winters, hibernating, then stirring to hungry life again as the greening earth renewed itself. A lot of strange things in the little belt. Don't think about it, Ventry warned himself. Just do what you came to do. Kill it. Kill the foul thing. Blow it out of existence. He carried 3 explosive charges in his knapsack, each equipped with a timing device. All right, make your plan. Set one here at the end of the train, another in the middle coach, and plant the final charge in the forward car. No good. If the thing had the power to animate its dead victims, it also had the power to fling off his explosive devices, to rid itself of them as a dog shakes leaves from its coat. I'll have to go after it the way you go after a snake. To kill a snake, you cut off its head. So, go for the brain. Go for the engine. The train had left the main rail system now, and was on a rusted spur track, climbing steeply into the Little Belt range. It was taking Ventry into the high mountains. One last meal of warm flesh, then the long winter's sleep. The train was going home. 3 cars to go. Axe in hand, Ventry was moving steadily toward the engine, through vacant, gaslit coaches, wondering how and when it would attack him again. Did it know he meant to kill it? Possibly. It had no fear of him. God knows it was strong, and no human had ever harmed it in the past. Does the snake fear the mouse? Maybe it would leave him alone to do his work. Maybe it didn't realize how lethal this mouse could be. But Ventry was wrong. Swaying in the clattering rush of the train, he was halfway down the aisle of the final coach when the tissue around him rippled into motion. Viscid black bubbles formed on the ceiling of the car and in the seats, growing, quivering, multiplying. One by one, the loathsome globes swelled and burst, giving birth to a host of nightmare figures, young and old, man, woman, child, eyes red and angry. They focused on Ventry in the clicking interior of the hell coach, moving toward him in a rotting tide. He had seen photos of many of them in the Lewiston Library. Vanished passengers, like Amy, devoured and absorbed, and now regenerated as fetid ectoplasmic horrors, literal extensions of the train itself. Ventry knew that he was powerless to stop them. The Amy thing had proven that. But he still had the axe, and a few vital seconds before the train things reached him. Ventry swung the razor blade left and right, slashing brutally at seat and floor, cutting deep with each swift blow. Fluid gushed from a dozen gaping wounds, a rubbery mass of coil-like innards, like spilled guts, erupted from the seat to Ventry's right, splashing him with gore. The train screamed into the Montana night, howling like a wounded beast. The passenger things lost form, melting into the aisle. Now, Ventry was at the final door, leading to the coal car directly behind the engine. He found it locked. The train had reached its destination at the top of the spur, was rolling down a side track leading to a deserted mine. Its home, its cave, its dark hiding place. The train would feast now. Paul Ventry used the last of his strength on the door, hacking at it, slashing wildly, cutting his way through. Free, in a freezing blast of night wind, Ventry scrambled across the coal tender toward the shining black locomotive, and reached it. A heavy, gelatinous membrane separated him from the control cabin. The membrane pulsed with veined life. Got to get inside, reach the brain of the thing. Ventry drove the blade deep, splitting the veined skin, and burst through into the cabin. Its interior was a shock to Ventry's senses. He was assailed by a stench so powerful that bile rushed into his throat. He fought back a rising nausea. Brass and wood and iron had become throbbing flesh. Levers and controls and pressure gauges were coated with a thick, crawling slime. The roof and sides of the cabin were moving. A huge, red, heart-like mass pulsed and shimmered wetly in the center of the cabin, its sickly crimson glow illuminating his face. He did not hesitate. Ventry reached into the knapsack, pulled out an explosive charge, and set the device for manual. All he needed to do was press a metal switch, toss the charge at the heart thing, and jump from the cabin. It was over. He'd won. But before he could act, the entire chamber heaved up in a bubbled, convulsing pincer movement, trapping Ventry like a fly in a web. He writhed in the jellied grip of the train thing. The explosive device had been jarred from his grasp. The axe, too, was lost in the mass of crushing slime tissue. Ventry felt sharp pain fire along his back. Teeth! The thing had sprouted rows of needled teeth and was starting to eat him alive. The knapsack. He was still wearing it. Gasping, dizzy with pain, Ventry plunged his right hand into the sack, closing bloodied fingers around the second explosive device. Pulling it loose, set it ticking. 60 seconds. If he could not fight free in that space of time, he'd go up with the train. A far better way to die than being ripped apart and devoured. Death would be a welcome release. Incredibly, the train thing seemed to know that its life was in jeopardy. Its shocked tissues drew back, cringing away from the ticking explosive charge. Ventry fell to his knees on the slimed floor. 30 seconds. He saw the sudden gleam of rails to his right, just below, and he launched himself in a plunging dive through the severed membrane. Struck ground. Searing pain. Right shoulder. Broken bone. Hell with it. Move, damn you, move! Ventry rolled over on his stomach, pain lacing his body. Pushed himself up. Standing now. 5 seconds. Ventry sprawled forward. Legs won't support me. Then crawl. Into heavy brush. Still crawling, dragging his lacerated, slime-smeared body toward a covering of rocks. Faster! No more time! Too late. The night became sudden day. The explosion picked up Ventry and tossed him into the rocks like a boneless doll. The trained thing screamed in a whistling death agony as the concussion sundered it, scattering its parts like wet confetti over the terrain. Gobbets of bleeding tissue rained down on Ventry as he lay in the rocks. But through the pain and the stench and the nausea, his lips were curved into a thin smile. He was unconscious when the Montana sun rose that morning, but when Sheriff John Longbow arrived on the scene, he found Paul Ventry alive and triumphant.
Yes, our guests have taken their permanent seats. From New York to time infinite. Are you ready to join them? Perhaps another story will lure you. Choose a car, any car, for the time we had a permanent guest. As they tell their tales of horror at its best. Come, yes, join me. My name is Terror, who rides the rails eternally upon the terror train.
Survived this trek? No turning back. Dare resist, just try. Step back inside, we'll be your guide. So many ways to die. Upon this ride, nowhere to hide. With us, you shall remain. Upon this ride, this hellish ride, we call the Terror Train. Terror Train Podcast, Episode 117, Montana. Produced by Krista Grabowski, David Schütz II, and Mary Genevieve Fortier. Podcast directed and arranged by David Schütz II. The Conductor, your narrator, was created by and played by David Schütz II. Terror, the Disembodied Voice, was created by and played by Mary Genevieve Fortier. Terror Train Podcast opening and closing poems written by Mary Genevieve Fortier. Host segment dialogue for Terror, the Disembodied Voice, written by Mary Genevieve Fortier. Production music: The House of Leaves, Chase Pulse, The Hive, and The Voices by Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com. Featured work: Lonely Train A-Comin', written by William F. Nolan. Production music: Colorless Aura, Long Note 4, Dopplerette, Echoes of Time version 2, Controlled Chaos, no percussion, Classic Horror 1, Irregular, Bump in the Night, Dark Walk, Decay, Unseen Horror, and Quinn's song, A New Man, by Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com. Additional sound effects by audiosoundclips.com. Podcast program edited by David Schütz II. The stories and poems presented in the Terror Train podcasts are all featured in the James Ward Kirk Publishing anthology, Terror Train, which was edited by Krista Grabowski and A. Henry Keene. Cover art by Stephen Cooney. Copyright 2014. Terror Train, Podcast Episode 117, Montana. Copyright 2014.